All right. Hi, I'm Keith Marks, Director of Next Stage Arts in Putney, Vermont, southeast corner of Vermont. And with me is Barry Stockwell, Programming Director and member of the Putney Historical Society. I just want to say thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you being here. Obviously, these times of COVID, we would love to have these types of events in our theater. But the upside to this distance is that we can reach out to someone like Phil Jamison in Asheville, North Carolina, and he can be presenting world-class presentations that we wouldn't normally have access to until he came this way. So we want to say thank you for tuning in. And with that, I'll turn it over to Barry. So Barry, will you tell us a little bit about your role at Next Stage and the Putney Historical Society before we bring on Phil?
Sure. Thanks, Keith. On behalf of the Putney Historical Society and Next Stage Arts Project, thank you all for joining us tonight. We truly appreciate your interest and support. These two organizations came together about 10 years ago around the renovation and restoration and use of our historic downtown former church, which is now Next Stage. We still share an office in what was once the church parlor, and PHS has exhibit and storage space in the building. I've got a foot in both camps, and for me, our most exciting joint collaborations are projects like tonight's. And though we can't, because of COVID, we can't gather in our theater or our community room or our kitchen or out on our dance floor, Next Stage can still produce and promote events like this. We're thrilled to bring you Professor of Traditional Music and Dance, Phil Jamison, and Hoedowns, Reels, and Frolics, Roots and Branches of Southern Appalachian Dance.
Phil, thanks for being here tonight. With that, we'll let you do your thing, and we'll be behind the scenes if you need anything. Thanks, Phil.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Happy to be here. Actually, in Asheville, North Carolina. I wish I was there. I'd much prefer to be in Putney and do this live and in person, but we'll do the best we can. Very happy to have the chance to share some of what I know about the Southern square dance traditions and the various influences on it. So I have a PowerPoint that I'll share with you, and I'll get right into it, and then probably take questions at the end. But if people have questions during the presentation, you can put them in the comment section, and I think I'll be able to see them. And if I don't answer them as I go along, we'll get to those at the end. But thank you for being here this evening. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get right to it. So let's see if we can work through the technology here and get right on it. So there we go. So the topic tonight is Hoedowns, Reels, and Frolics. And I see that Stuart has already said he's ready for a frolic. And Stuart, do you know what a frolic is? Do you know what a hoedown is and a reel? These are types of dances. Frolic is basically a dance party. So it could be any type of dance, but a country dance party. And we're going to be talking about the roots and branches of Southern Appalachian dance. So first of all, I like to begin this by saying, what is Southern Appalachian dance? I know a lot of you folks are probably up in New England. Putney's in Vermont, and those are the Northern Appalachians. What is Southern Appalachian dance? So it encompasses a number of different traditions, and I'll share a few of these here. First of all, we have the square dances, and the Southern square dance is a unique tradition. It's different than the quadrille square dance tradition of the Northeast, and different than Western square dances, but it is one of our traditions. Another type of Southern Appalachian dance would be the step dances. This would be what's often called flat footing, buck dancing, clogging, basically percussive dances that people do with their feet. This is a friend of mine, Thomas Maupin from Middle Tennessee, who's a great dancer, but that's another part of our tradition too. A third part is what's called team clogging, and this is kind of a combination of the two, putting square dances on stage and dancers wearing tap shoes and costumes and putting on a show, and that's fairly common too. Another part of our tradition, if you go to a local dance venue, is people like to do couple dances. And sometimes if you go to what they bill as a square dance, they might only do a couple square dances during the whole evening, and the rest is two-steps and waltzes and freestyle clogging. But two-steps and waltzes are pretty well known. And then people do like to do the Virginia Reel, which is a dance that became popular through school education, physical ed programs throughout the country, and basically in the 20th century. And you will find people at rural dance venues doing that. There's another tradition that is not very common anymore, but was at one time, called play parties and singing games. And these are basically dances without the fiddle. The fiddle was the devil's instrument, they say. Made people frolic and dance and have fun and drink and carry on and stay up all night. And so it was discouraged by the church in many communities. And the way people got around it was they would sing songs and do the dances to the singing. And since the fiddle wasn't there, they could say it wasn't a dance. And the church said, well, that's okay. So for little kids, you might think of, Ring Around the Rosie and London Bridges Falling Down, but there were ones for adolescents and young adults too. But that was part of the tradition, not so much anymore. And finally, there are cakewalks. And the cakewalks, it's a tradition you'll find all over the country. Basically a way to raffle off a cake. And the music plays, dancers go around in a single file circle, and when the music stops, a number's drawn out of a hat or something, and someone wins the cake. So all these are part of our dance tradition that you'll encounter if you go to regional dance venues in Southern Appalachia. But for today, what I'd like to do is focus on the Southern square dance. And here you see an image from the 1930s. This is a square dance on a platform out in Haywood County, just west of here. And it was actually at a ranch. That's why the kids are on a horse in the background. And you'll notice that there are 8 couples on this dance platform. And that's pretty common to find 8 couples in a square dance here. So let's jump right into this and have a look at a dance here. This is a dance that was filmed a few years back in 1990 at Fancy Gap, Virginia Elementary School.
All go ahead and circle in. Halfway back. Beg your pardon, promenade. Ladies on the left. Ladies go forward to men drop back. Bring your partner to Georgia, Alabama. Yeah, turn it on when you're hot, you're hot.
All right, so there you see a square dance. And I see in one of the comments, somebody says the slides are blurry. So I'm hoping that they're coming through if people have a good connection, and hope everyone else can see them. So if they are blurry, I'm not sure why that would be, but I'm hoping they're coming through. So what you saw there, what I hope you saw, was a square dance. And the first thing you might notice that it wasn't in a square formation, it was a big circle. But that, even though it's a big circle dance, we still call them square dances around here. And this is one of the forms that you'll find. Now, I've been calling square dances for many years. And at some point, I got curious about where these dances actually come from. And this is something that, you know, I'm just curious about. And so I started looking into it, and almost everywhere I looked, I would come across this account from this guy named Cecil Sharp. And Cecil Sharp was an English ballad collector. And with his colleague Maud Carpeles, they came over to this country, and they discovered that people were still singing the old British ballads in the southern mountains. And so a lot of these ballads had died out in England, and they came down here to collect ballads and hopefully reintroduce them to England. Ballads like Barbara Allen and so on, but the old ballads. So they came down on this ballad expedition, and they came through Asheville and did collecting here. And at one point, they traveled up into eastern Kentucky, and they visited the Pine Mountain Settlement School in Kentucky. And while they were there, they were collecting ballads. One of the teachers said, we have dances too. Would you like to see one of our folk dances? And they got the kids out to do a demonstration. And what Sharp wrote to the person who was financing his travels, Helen Storrow up in Boston, he wrote, I came across the most wonderful dance the other day, a form of circular English country dance of a type of which I know nothing. So he saw this dance, and he really didn't know what it was that he was seeing, but he knew that people were singing old ballads from England and Scotland going way, way back. And he sort of jumped to the conclusion that these must be old English, long lost English dances too. And he thought, wouldn't it be great to reintroduce these dances to the folks back in England? He was very involved with the English Country Dance Society over there. And in Kentucky, the folks, they referred to doing these dances as running a set, meaning doing a set of dances. Or, you know, the term running was used like as if you were running an auction or running a still or something, but they were running sets of dances. And Sharp published these dances, descriptions of them the following year, and he called it the running set. He made up that name for it, which isn't what people call it here. They were basically doing square dances. But this is how they were presented, and Sharp put descriptions of the figures, which is really wonderful. But then he went into quite lengthy essay about where these dances came from, and sort of said these are old English dances, you know, from the green fields of old England and long lost Anglo-Saxon culture. And there were things about this that just really didn't make sense to me when I was hearing this. And Sharp's account of these dances basically had been repeated and perpetuated for close to 100 years. And that was something I wanted to get to the bottom of. You know, I knew that for instance, the instrumental traditions here, you know, people were playing banjos, and those weren't from the old country and, you know, British Isles. And the singing traditions, yeah, they sang the old British ballads, but they also sang gospel songs and shape note hymns and Tin Pan Alley songs and minstrel songs and all kinds of other stuff. So it just didn't make sense that the dances were this pure Anglo-Saxon thing. So what I realized is that Sharp really got two things wrong about this that sort of led him down the wrong path. The first is he saw the people of the Southern Mountains as Anglo-Saxon, and described the amazingly rich cultural heritage of the mountains, and what he called arrested degeneration of Anglo-Saxon racial inheritance. This is how he saw it. He saw these people as old English people, English peasants locked away in the mountains, and still preserving their Anglo-Saxon heritage. And what he didn't acknowledge was that the people of the mountains were what one person described as a mixed multitude of all classes and complexions. That comes from Charles Woodmason from back in the 1700s, who traveled through here. Basically, there were people of European descent, there were people of African descent, there were Native Americans, and in fact, the English were a minority. It was mostly Scots, Irish, and Germans, and there were French people. There was slavery in every county in the mountains. It wasn't just white Anglo-Saxons, and there was a lot of exchange of culture between the different groups and sharing of things in the mountains. So it wasn't just this Anglo-Saxon thing. And here you see a scene from Asheville, where I live, of blacks and whites on the street together. And so there was certainly music being shared across racial lines. The other thing that Sharp got wrong, which Maud Karpeles later wrote about, is talking about this image of Appalachian isolation, this idea that, you know, people are locked away in the hills and hollers and never get out and see the outside world and have no outside influences. And that seemed kind of strange to me too. And part of that was sort of played up by what they call the local color writers of the late 1800s, who portrayed the people here as being, you know, in a strange and exotic place, this idea of Appalachian otherness. Here's an illustration from one of those stories from Harper's Weekly of a dance in West Virginia. And the people do look a little bit backwoods, but these articles were written for a northern urban audience who were used to reading about strange and exotic places in the world, like, you know, India, Africa, Appalachia, you know, all these strange faraway places. And they really played up the stereotypes and made it sound as if people never did leave. But when I was researching this, I read lots of travel journals, and I found out that before the highways and the even the railroads, the way people got their goods to market was on the rivers. And this was really the back door to this region. A lot of people came here down what is now I-81, coming down through the Shenandoah Valley to settle here. But all these rivers that feed from this area feed into the Ohio River and then down into the Mississippi and end up in New Orleans. And this is how people got their goods to market. This is also how people traveled. They would float down the Ohio River. They couldn't come back up, but they would load up huge boats with their hogs and wheat and whiskey and corn, whatever they had to sell, and wait for the high water. And then they'd float down these tributaries to the Ohio and the Mississippi, and they would get to New Orleans. They would sell their goods. They would sell the boats for lumber. And many of the old houses in New Orleans are still built out of barge boards. And then the people, they would walk home. They would walk 450 miles from New Orleans back up to Nashville, up the Natchez Trace, an old Indian trail. And then they'd come on back up to their homes again. And the thing about this is it's not one or two or dozens of people, but hundreds of people did this every single year from all these rivers. So not that everybody left the region, but there were people coming and going all the time. And New Orleans was, you know, the height of culture at the time. It was French territory and height of fashion. And, you know, people were exposed to a lot of different kinds of music and dance. Here's a picture of one of these flatboats. And you see there's no motor, so they're just floating down the river. It would take weeks to get down there. And typically on these boats, they would hire a fiddler to be part of the crew. And the fiddler would keep people entertained. And there are lots and lots of accounts of the sound of fiddles as these boats floated by. And for you musicians out there, if you look at the Southern fiddle repertoire, so many of our dance tunes are named after these rivers. You know, you have Boatin' Up Sandy River, you have the Big Scioto, you have Three Forks of Cheat, you have Mississippi Sawyer. A sawyer is actually a submerged tree that bobs up and down with the current. But there was so much of our fiddle repertoire comes from people hanging out on these rivers. So it was clear to me that people were not just locked away in the hills, but they were coming and going all the time. So I started thinking about, well, where do the dances really come from if they're not just Old English And I thought, well, one clue is to think about the music. So if you think about the Southern Appalachian dance music, here's a picture of Fiddle and Powers and family. They lived in Southwest Virginia. He played fiddle, and these are 4 of his kids: banjo, ukulele, mandolin, and guitar. And they played for lots of dances in the area. So thinking about the dance music, I think, is a clue to understanding the dances, because you can't really separate the dances from the music. The two are one. So if we think about the music, the fiddle was the first instrument that people danced to, that European settlers brought to the region. And it was small, lightweight, easy to carry, but also it was an instrument that you could build yourself. You could fabricate yourself on the frontier. The top could be spruce and the back maple, and you string it up with some kind of catgut and drag a horse's tail across it, and you have a dance instrument. And this was the dance band back in the early days. So here you see in this illustration, you have a lone fiddler, though it is interesting that there is this African-American kid playing rhythm on the side of the barn at the same time. And these 2 dancers doing some kind of a step dance there on the barn floor. But this was the instrument that was used for dances before they had other instruments. So you could get a lot of the early accounts, the only instrument being played is the fiddle. But one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the fiddling tradition doesn't just come from Northern Europe. There was a fiddling tradition in West Africa going back to the 12th century. And here you have one of these instruments. You look at that bow, it looks like a bow and arrow type bow, but it's basically a skin stretched over some kind of a gourd or something, and a stick neck with just 1 string. And they actually still play these instruments in West Africa. Here's a recent video from Ghana. So it's amazing, the sound from that 1 string. But people who were enslaved and brought to the New World from Africa, they knew what fiddling was. And this idea of dragging a bow across a string to make a sound was not a foreign idea. And people did devise homemade fiddles. Here's this actual photograph of a 3-string fiddle, homemade fiddle. Look at that bow. It looks just like the one from Africa. But here's a kid who's made his own fiddle and is learning to play. And when people learned how to play, and if they got their hands on a European style instrument and learned the European dance music, they would be in a better place in life. They would not be working in the fields if they were enslaved. They'd be playing for the dancers in the big house. And this is an illustration of some fiddlers in East Tennessee. And what I discovered is that the dance music at public events throughout the country back in the day was played by Black people. Playing music for a dance is a servant's position. And those of you musicians who've ever played a wedding gig, you know what I'm talking about. You're hired to play for somebody's wedding. And if you get fed, you might be eating in the kitchen with the kitchen help. You're not at the table with the bride and groom. But it's a servant's position providing music. And while there were certainly white fiddlers, what I discovered is there were tremendous numbers of Black fiddlers. And these folks really influenced the fiddle styles of the South. So I came across Black fiddlers again and again and again. And not just in the South, but since we're talking about the Putney Historical Society, there were certainly Black fiddlers in the North as well. And and as there was slavery in the North, there were fiddlers. In a book by Kate Van Winkle Keller, she documents references to black fiddlers, and in the times before, in colonial times, and had 40 instances in New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, all these states. You would find black fiddlers providing the music for white dancers, as you see in this illustration here too. Two of those that I'd like to point out. One is there was someone named Sampson in Concord, New Hampshire, who in one historical account was a famous fiddler who played for dances on election days. Wouldn't that be great if we had dances on election days nowadays? We don't do that anymore. But he was the go-to guy. And an even earlier account of an indigenous player from the 1600s in Maine, somebody named Skesway, if that's how you say his name, I think, a Native American who was the go-to when you wanted to have a dance. So Native Americans also learned to play the fiddle and play for dances, as well as black folks. Here's an illustration. This is by the same artist who did the painting of the fiddler in the barn. And here you see a black fiddler playing for a white dance, a white party gathering here. This was very, very common. If people were having a party, they would send for the local black fiddler. And up near Putney, or before we get to Putney, in Washington County, just outside of Albany or up near Saratoga, was Solomon Northup. And he played for dances in the big hotels in Saratoga. And if you saw the film 12 Years a Slave that came out a few years ago, he had the misfortune of being captured into slavery. He was a free black, played for dances, and someone basically offered him a gig in Washington, D.C., and he was drugged. And next thing he knew, he was on a ship headed for Mississippi. And he took him 12 years to convince people that he was a free man and got back to his family in Washington County. But in the meantime, it was the fiddle that got him through his ordeal. He played for dances and just had a better place in life during those 12 years than the other folks who were working out in the fields. But I was going to mention John Putnam, who was an African-American fiddler, former slave in Greenfield, Mass. He was a fiddler and a dance caller and had a band. And one thing I found really interesting is back in the day, aside from playing music for dances, black folks were also the barbers. And many of the fiddlers and dance callers that I came across were also barbers. And these two occupations kind of make sense. You have your barber chair by day and go out and play dances at night. And barbershops are probably great places to get together with people to jam, play music. And it makes you wonder about the whole tradition of barbershop quartet singing, which originally was from the African-American community once upon a time. But anyway, here's a poster from one of his dances in 1858 in Shelburne Falls, and he played second fiddle in the band. So he had a lead fiddler who could lead things out, and he would be prompting the dances at the time. But I don't know much more about him other than this, but he'd be someone to look into if you're up in that neck of the woods from Greenfield. Now, the other instrument that I want to mention, draw a little attention to, is the banjo before we get back to the dances. And the banjo, as you no doubt know, has its roots in Africa. There on the right, you see illustration of some African instruments, including one that looks a lot like a banjo. And here's an illustration of a banjo player and someone playing rhythm on a gourd beside him. This was the instrument that enslaved Africans played for their own folks dancing on plantations. So if it was a plantation frolic, chances are they'd be dancing to a banjo. But in the 1700s, black fiddlers or black musicians put the banjo and fiddle together. And there was one account I know of from the 1756 from Newport, Rhode Island, And another one from the Chesapeake Bay in 1770s, this idea of putting this Northern European fiddle with this African banjo together. And really, this is the core of the Southern String Band. And this is what created this new American style music. And is really crucial to our music. So when people were playing for dances, you know, they would bring banjos and fiddles. And this is an illustration I love of some folks going out. I don't know where this is, but in the cold of the winter, headed out to a dance gig. And they did have a cello as well, because people weren't carrying basses around with them at that point. So let's get back to the dances. And if we think about the Southern square dances, one way I approached this topic is to think about what makes these dances different than New England square dances or Western square dances. And there's certain characteristics. And the first is that they are a circular visiting couple format that can include any number of couples. So it's just not a square with 4 couples, but a big circle like you saw in that video earlier. And they have, you know, visiting couple figures, meaning one couple works their way around the circle, which is different than a quadrille where the head 2 couples do something and the side 2 couples do something. But it's this circular format, and it could be a circle of 4 couples or a circle of 20 couples. It really doesn't matter, but it's still a circular format. The second characteristic for the Southern squares is the idea that the choreography is flexible and freeform, and they're not timed out. The figures aren't timed out like a contra dance where we have 2 A's and 2 B's. They're very freeform. You basically call out the figure when people are ready for the next thing. And the choreography is flexible. As a dance caller, I can change it any way I want mid-dance. I can surprise the dancers with something new, but it's not prescribed and composed and written down like you would find in a contra dance or a Northern quadrille. So that's another characteristic. A third characteristic is this huge repertoire of distinctive Southern dance figures. When you count up the different dance figures in a contra dance or a quadrille square dance in the North, it's fairly limited. But in the Southern dances, there is a huge repertoire and distinctive figures that you don't find in other dances. You don't find people doing bird in the cage or duck for the oyster or many of these other things in contra dances or the quadrilles. And the last characteristic that I'd like to point out is the tempo of the dances. They can be pretty fast, and you can get away with that because the timing of the music does not indicate the timing of the dance figures. If the dancers aren't ready to get to the next thing, you just wait a little bit until they are ready. So you don't have to have the music at a set tempo, and it can be really fast and really exciting, which is a lot of fun. So when I think about the Southern squares, I think about these characteristics, and I think about what accounts for these things. And the place I went is to look at the earlier social dances in America that preceded these dances. And I would start with English country dances, which were the ancestor of the contra dance. These are the dances that Cecil Sharp thought he was seeing in Eastern Kentucky. And these were dances that were popular in the English colonies in America. But there was no such thing as a dance caller back then. You had to go to dancing school to learn the figures. And then after you learn the figures in dancing school, then you can go to the ball and you know what you're doing. But there was nobody up on the stage yelling at you what to do. And if you didn't know what to do, you tag on the bottom of the line and watch the other dancers until you catch on. And these dances were mainly taught in the East Coast, in the English colonies but not so much in the back country. So there's not a lot of evidence of their influence on the Southern square dances. However, the figure Chase the Squirrel probably was borrowed from these dances because there was an English country dance with that name that had that figure. So they probably had a little bit of influence, but not as much as the reels. Almost all the accounts I read of dances in the back country were of reels. And these are dances that were Scottish and Irish. The predominant settlers in the back country were Scots-Irish. These were very simple dances, usually with kind of weaving figures, like, if you're reeling down the road, you're weaving along. that kind of thing, but you didn't have to go to dancing school to know these. Very simple movements. Here you see one for 3 couples in a tavern, and just repetitive kind of weaving figures and some setting steps they would be doing, but nothing too complicated. Anybody could catch on. And here you notice, of course, there's a black fiddler playing for the dance. Sometimes they were done with 4 dancers, 4-handed reels. And here you see in a wayside inn, and yet again, another black fiddler playing for these. There were also some that were in circular form that I read about. This illustration, though, comes from Canada, but I read accounts of circular reels as well. And the idea is that made me think that perhaps that's where this big circle format of our Southern dances comes from, perhaps. But there were circular reels as well. Now, another type of dance that influenced the tradition are the French dances called cotillions and quadrilles. And these became popular after the American Revolution, when Americans were saying, wait a minute, why are we doing English country dances? We just fought the English in a war. And in many parts of the country, people rejected the English country dances, and they loved the French, who helped them defeat the British, and adopted the French square dances, which were fashionable in Paris and in French places at that time. And what this did was it opened up the U.S. for French dancing masters to come and teach these dances in America. And these dances, there were no callers. Again, you had to go to dancing school to learn the dance figures. And so you had a lot of French people coming over here, and I found lots of accounts of French dancing masters setting up shop here and there to teach these dances. And one of them was that guy named John James Audubon, who the guy who painted the pictures of the birds. In 1803, he floated down the Ohio River, and he set up a dancing school in what is now Louisville, Kentucky. And that's how he made his living. That's how he paid for those bird paintings. His day job was teaching dance and fiddle and flute, but he had a dancing school. And it's from these French dances that we get the 4-couple square form, and also certain other elements like the verse-chorus structure of the dances, the grand right and left, the promenade, and also French dance terminology. Here, 200 years later, I still use words like sachet, allemande, promenade, do-si-do, which means back to back. So they were using French words to teach these dances, and those words are still being used. And they also introduced the idea of ladies and gents as terminology. And this was sort of pushback against the church, the church didn't like all these Americans dancing, and so the idea was the dancing masters would teach etiquette as well as the dances, and so made sure that the young ladies and gents would be learning proper etiquette in addition to dances, which supposedly made these dances more agreeable to church people. Other dances that influenced our tradition were other European social dances. The Grand March, Promenade was popular way to open a ball, and also couple dances, the waltz, two-step, polka, in particular around the 1840s. These became very popular too, and some of these filtered into the tradition. There were certainly Native American dances here, and Native American dances typically were in a circular form, and sometimes they had single file circles, so perhaps that's where our single file circles come from, not sure. But very early on, there was intermarriage between European Americans and Native Americans, so there were Native Americans doing the European dances and very early on. So it's a little bit hard to see where the influence is there. The bigger influence is from the African American dances. And in Africa, the dances were generally in big ring forms. And this woman, Tinny Force, a former slave from Kentucky, described during slavery times, the big rings were the way they would do it. And here you see in the picture, there's a circle of dancers. And one of the things they would talk about, and I first saw this in a slave narrative, a narrative from a former slave, is the bird in the cage. And what I discovered, that there are dances in Africa where a dancer gets in the middle of a ring of dancers and imitates a bird. And I looked in the European tradition and I could find nothing like that. So I actually believe that the figure Bird in the Cage probably has African roots, and though people dance it all over the country now, but that's probably where it started. Another former slave, Robert Anderson from Kentucky, he talked about dancing the dances like the white folks dance them, as well as their own dances. And this is sort of an interesting idea, is that people who were enslaved, they did the African dances, but they were also adopting the dances from Europe at the same time. And in this illustration, you see some dancers at a plantation frolic. And you look at these dancers, you can see it's not a big ring. It doesn't look like an African ring dance. But there's something that really identifies it as a European style dance. And what that is the male-female coupling of the dancers. In the African tradition and the Native American tradition, the dancers were not paired up male and female. That was a European thing. So you can clearly see that here. And you see over on the one side, there's the fiddler. And on the other side, there's a guy who is calling out the dance figures. And you have to think about it. These folks were not sent to dancing school. How could they know these European dances without somebody calling out the figures? And this was something that I just kind of struck me like a bolt of lightning. It took me a long time to wrap my head around the idea that dance calling could have come from the African American tradition of call and response. In African dancing, there's vocalization with the dances, and you don't see that in the European dances. So I started looking for the earliest references to dance calling. And I found a reference from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia from the 1760s. They don't call it calling or prompting, but they say there's this is written by somebody visiting from Europe, saying he was surprised by the chanting to the sound of the violin. But by the time of the American Revolution, there are instances of slaves on plantations dancing English country dances. Now, and as I said, they weren't sent to dancing school. So how could they do these dances without somebody prompting them? The earliest documented dance caller that I've come across is 1819 in New Orleans. And then I found another one in South Carolina, 1825, Cincinnati, Boston, Lebanon Springs, New York, right near Albany. So you see, very early on, there were black callers throughout the country. And I'm not sure that calling spread from New Orleans to these other places like that in such a short period of time. I even think that it may have come from the Caribbean, where a lot of Africans were taken before they were brought to this country. And so there, I know that in I think Jamaica or some places down there, they dance quadrilles with somebody calling out the figures. So it's possible that dance calling came from the West Indies. But anyway, by the 1830s, there were black callers all over the country. And the earliest I could find of a European American caller was somebody in Michigan who was learning to call in the 1830s. At first, the dancing masters totally rejected this idea of dance calling because it's going to put them out of business. It's going to close down their dancing schools, and it did. But by the 1850s, they start putting out books saying this is the way to call a dance, and manuals on how to call. And it became the thing, and nobody needed to go to dancing school anymore. The biggest thing that dance calling did was it allowed for all the elements of all these different dances to combine into this new form. And in it, as I'd say, it democratized the dances, meaning it wasn't top down. Anybody could do them. Anybody could put together any dance figures they wanted. But it also meant that the dances could be transmitted and head west with people. So as people headed west, they took the dances with them, and it became a folk tradition. This was an oral tradition. It was not a written tradition, and the dances got passed on. And that's why, Laura Ingalls Wilder talks about her pa calling out dances and do-si-do and so on out on the prairie. And that's how these dances got moved along. Dance calling was the secret ingredient. It was the glue that held everything together and really made these dances possible. Now, these dances were shared in the Black community as well as the white community. And this is a film from 1914 of an African-American quadrille. The guy on the back, when you can see his face, he's calling the dance figures. They're doing right, left through and right, left back. Circle left. Single file back and swing. They do a little show-off steps, which is kind of interesting, and then they swing, some setting steps. So we don't know who these dancers were or exactly where this was. They're actually dancing to a jazz band. But these dances were popular in African-American communities as well as white communities. It wasn't that the two would dance together, but it was shared culture. They were shared dances, and you know, these dances were not just in the South. Some of you perhaps know of Daisy Turner up there, who was from Grafton, Vermont, not far from Putney. Her parents, her father, Alexander Turner, was a former slave from Virginia. There's a picture of him playing fiddle, and her mother there playing, looks like an interesting looking guitar. And I don't know who the banjo player was, but Daisy Turner, African-American woman, grew up in southern Vermont, and she talked about the dances they would have in their house. So they were, you know, the Black community was still participating in these dances. And a number of years ago, I interviewed a number of elderly women here in Asheville, and they talked about their parents' generation still did barn dances and square dances and played banjos and fiddles. But in the 20th century, that all disappeared. And one thing that happened is these traditions became whitewashed. And they were portrayed as white culture. And there are a number of things that made that happen. One thing here in Asheville, we have something called the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival, which was billed and promoted to promote the dances of the Anglo-Saxon, you know, English settlers, that, you know, this culture that's preserved by the mountaineers. And basically, Black folks were not invited. They were not invited to be on stage because these festivals were set up to promote Anglo-Saxon culture in the mountains. Also, the recording companies back in the 1920s did not want to record Black hillbillies playing banjos and fiddles. They wanted the Black folks to be playing blues and ragtime. And that was basically for marketing purposes, how they would market and sell this music. So the white musicians and the Black musicians were very much separated and segregated by that as well. But also other kinds of music were coming in, and African-American community moved on away from the banjos and fiddles and square dances. So you don't see a lot of folks doing this anymore in the Black community. One exception here in North Carolina were the Thompsons, Odell and Joe Thompson, who are cousins who played dance, fiddle and banjos for dance music right up to the end. And Joe Thompson was a mentor to the Carolina Chocolate Drops, who are still out there carrying on the Black string band tradition. But basically the music and dances were sort of eliminated from the Black community. So I'd like to get back to I mentioned these four characteristics of the Southern Squares, and now that I've sort of run you through all these different dance forms, I hope I'm not going too fast. I'd like to point out where I think some of these characteristics come from. And if we think about the visiting couple circular format, some of these big Scots-Irish circular reels were like that. The chorus figures come from the French cotillions and quadrilles, as does the grand right and left and the promenade. The flexible choreography and freeform timing, that's really happens because you have the dance calling. You can get away with that. You can make it up as you go. The large repertoire of dance figures. You have things like Chase the Rabbit, Chase the Squirrel, that probably comes from English country dances. Georgia Ragtang from Scots Irish reels, which is basically, it is a reel. Bird in the Cage, probably African. Single file circles, perhaps from Native American dances. And then the Grand March shows up in these dances as well. The fast tempo, again, I would say it's the African American dance calling that makes that possible, because it makes the dances flexible. So with that in mind, this is the video that we looked at earlier, and I'm going to show it to you again. And what I've done is I've added some captions to point out some of the figures. You see they're starting in a big circle. So here they swing their partner in promenade, and that's what they call waltz swing, which comes from the German waltz, the promenade from the French quadrilles and the Grand March. So here's a single file circle. Now there were figures in the Grand March that did this, and Native American dances also had single file circles. So that's hard to say where that came from. So this is what locally they call the Georgia Alabama, or it's called the Georgia Ragtang. And this is basically a Scots Irish reel. And what the dancers do here now is the caller kind of drops out for a little while, and the dancers are just on their own, completely out of time with the music, or with the phrasing of the music, I should say. They're stepping in time. That's Penton Flippin', by the way, the yellow shirt. So each couple goes and finds a new couple. There's visiting couple things, very freeform. And this is often how dances are done around Mount Erie. So at this point, the caller says, swing your partner in promenade. He gets them back into a big circle. So they get back in a big circle and do a closing figure. And this is something, there's a figure in the French quadrilles called the jig figure, where they swing everybody. And when we saw the African-American quadrille, they were doing the same thing, swinging each of the people. So what I hope you see is that these dances, you know, to go back to Cecil Sharp, they're just not pure Celtic or Anglo-Saxon racial inheritance, but these are American hybrids, and they developed during the 19th century. They were not here when the first settlers came to the Southern Mountains, but they developed during the 1800s, and all the different elements reflect the racial and cultural diversity of this region and basically of the United States. So, you know, I think of these as, you know, true American dances. They are, you know, people talk about the melting pot, but it's very clear that they have lots of different influences, and they are a reflection of the American culture. So this is what I wanted to share with you here tonight. And if you want to know more about this, this is just one of the topics that I cover in my book, Hoedowns, Reels, and Frolics. And I just discovered today that University of Illinois Press is having a 50% off sale for the holidays. So you can get the book 50% off. But in the book, I discuss all the different dance types that we have down here, in addition to the squares. I also have a website with lots of resources on it, including videos and audio files of early dance callers from the 1920s, films of flatfooters and buck dancers and Charleston dancers and so on. So feel free to check out the website. And I'd certainly like to thank the folks at Next Stage. Thanks to Keith and Barry for hosting this, and glad to support the Putney Historical Society. And I've seen that there's some questions in the comments, so I guess I'll maybe turn to Keith and ask the best way to deal with this.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hope you've enjoyed Phil's enlightening presentation. Wow, it kind of reframes a lot of American culture for me. So yeah, we'll start here. Andy has a question here. It says, Phil, if you get a chance, can you talk a bit about syncopation in Southern fiddling? Is this perhaps the influence of the banjo? Thanks.
Yeah. Hey, Andy. Well, I mean, people attribute the syncopation in Southern fiddling to the African influence on it. There's something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about recently, which is totally nerding out about, is the influence of the banjo on the music. And I really think that it did change the rhythm of the music. And when I think about in the South, the banjo was the accompanying instrument to the fiddle, and in the North, the accompanying instrument more likely would be the piano. And what I found is that if you listen to a Southern fiddler and a Northern fiddler, there's a very different rhythmic emphasis going on. And I think about it like this: is when I first learned banjo, I learned that the rhythm with your right hand is bum diddy bum diddy bum diddy bum diddy. And when I listen to Northern fiddle tunes, that is the rhythm I hear. Like if it's St. Anne's Reel, it's dum da da dum da da dum da da dum diddy bum diddy bum. I hear that. And when I listen to Southern fiddle tunes, a lot of times what I hear is not bum diddy, but diddy bum diddy bum diddy bum diddy bum, which starts the music ahead of the beat. And it very much matches a lot of the stepping that we do. If you're a flat footer or a clogger, it's a shuffle step, da da dum da da dum da da dum. And I really see that as perhaps an influence of the banjo overlaid on the fiddle tunes that you don't hear in the Northern fiddle tunes. So next time you're listening to a Southern or a Northern fiddler, see if that's true. But certainly the syncopation, it perhaps is from the banjo or from other things.
Great, thanks, Phil. There's another question here. It relates to the video that you showed twice of the group, the varying dance steps from the video you showed. It says there's a man in jeans and a white shirt kicking his legs out while doing the free figures.
Right.
Where does this kick improvisational style come from?
So I don't know who that guy was, but he's just somebody kicking up his heels. I mean, the thing is that with this music, at a dance, people will be doing some flat footing and clogging and, step dancing throughout the dances. So that's very common to see. And he's just kicking up his heels in a big way, just getting into it. So that's a very common thing to see. Oftentimes people do they have their own style of doing things. That certainly looks like his style, but it's all part of the fun.
Phil, I have a question. You talked a little bit about why the African-American communities became disconnected from this cultural dance and music. And so is there any work being done to sort of reconnect and re-educate, at least in Asheville and where you are, in terms of just, educating people on this history and letting the African-American communities know about this legacy that they have?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. There is a conference here in Asheville every year about African Americans in Western North Carolina. And a few years ago, after my book came out, I did a presentation there about this very topic. And there were a number of folks from the local Black community who came up to me afterwards and said, yes, we'd always seen the cloggers at the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival. We just always thought this was just British Anglo-Saxon stuff. We didn't know we were part of the story. That doesn't mean they're going to run out and get banjos and fiddles and start square dancing. But there's a lot of Black folks don't know the history behind this, and a lot of white folks don't either. A lot of people just don't know what's behind it. and it's sort of a hidden history, which I think is like a lot of things in America that, you know, we talk about Black Lives Matter and African American influence on U.S. culture. It's all through our music. I mean, can you name a style of music or dance that's American that doesn't have Black influence? I can't. So it's there. The Carolina Chocolate Drops are probably the leading folks who are out, you know, performing, you know, picking up this music and reviving it. But for the most part, they're playing to white audiences. But there are a handful of people of color who are getting into this music and these dances and doing it, but it's a very small minority.
So one last question from Joe Crawford. Joe asks, have you made any connections to Quebecois dance? I'm seeing several similarities.
Oh boy. Well, Quebecois dance, yes, I'm sure there are similarities, and they probably have some very similar roots obviously from the quadrilles and from the reels. You know, look at who settled there. So from Scots-Irish as well as French. But yes, there are certainly similarities. I can't say that one influenced the other, except they have similar roots.
Well, Phil, thank you so much. You really delivered a lot of information and kind of reframed a lot of cultural norms for a lot of us, I think. And this has been a great presentation. I'm so thankful that you were available to do this. And Barry, thank you so much for shouldering and bringing this. And Phil has a Putney connection. His brother Tom lives here in Putney and is part of the Putney Historical Society. So we want to give a big nod to Tom and the Putney Historical Society. Tonight has been a fundraiser for them, so we're excited. Phil, thank you for coming, and yeah, I think that's our presentation.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to do this, and I hope when we get, I want to call a dance again. I want to be dancing again. So maybe sometime in the near future we can get up there and do a dance in person.
That sounds
but
great.
In the meantime, everybody stay safe and stay healthy, and hope to see you on the dance floor.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.